I guess before we get started, I want to open it up for any, questions or thoughts you may have had while reading this book. I hope today we'll get into chapter 3 on martyrdom and persecution, which I mean, just the very first section is enlightening to me, and so I'm really interested in talking about it. Um, any thoughts? Well, last time we're in chapter 2 and talking about the dilemmas of diversity and how it is that, various forms of Christianity, what we, will call Christianity. Let's make a distinction between the Christianities of the first 3 centuries and then in the ensuing centuries after Constantine, we move closer and closer toward a Christianity that's established as orthodox, and then all of those over against the orthodox are seen as heretical. But what Frederickson is doing here is giving us a very clear sense of just the variety of interpretations of who Jesus was and what the relationship of the church was at that time to Judaism. And you might remember there were some who wanted to maintain a continuity with the Jewish scriptures, just reading them as prototypes or as uh, prophecies of the coming of Christ. We talked about Justin Martyr last time being of that ilk. But then there were others as well who wanted nothing to do with the Jewish scriptures, having been informed by Platonic and Neoplatonic creation ideas about a demiurge in Plato's Timaeus, for example, who takes pre-existing matter and forms it into a world based upon, the transcendent forms. And of course, the demiurge is this, not this being that's simply used for the purposes of creating the world. In many ways, it's a kind of a deus ex machina. It's Plato's way of getting around the whole idea of, creation itself. He wasn't concerned so much with the how of it all, the way that many people are these days. But we saw that there were many. The last time we looked, we were talking about Marcion, and you might remember Valentinus, two of the uh, heretical thinkers who really saw the Jewish scriptures as being reflective of people who had a very skewed understanding of who God was. In fact, Valentinus comes right out and says, the Jews weren't even worshiping the right God. They were all mistaken about it. And there's a real dualism that comes with a lot of these heresies too. There, the sense that this created world, the world of matter, is a place um, not to be trusted. And that's going to carry over. And we see this in some ways already in the Apostle Paul, but that's going to carry over into later Christianity, right up to the present, where we have a suspicion of the body and the desires that we have to keep in check. But speaking of the body, one of the aspects of the dualistic thinking that we're seeing at this time is that based in Greek philosophy as well, when we think about Plato and we think about Aristotle, is the idea that there is a qualitative difference between men and women. You might remember that Aristotle's explanation of how females come to be is that in the male sperm, which is basically planted in the womb of the female, uh, all beings that are planted in this way would develop fully. If they're developed fully, they become males. But if they don't develop fully, then they're born as females. So a female, according to Aristotle, is an undeveloped male. So you get a very clear sense of the qualitative difference between men and women. Men are seen as rational, women are seen as irrational, hysterical, quite is the Greek word used for it. Um, and therefore, anything associated with women could not be trusted. Now, this raises an interesting question, and Fredrickson introduces this into her chapter on diversity because Paul has a statement about in the church, due to the working of the Holy Spirit, all of the old qualitative differences have been somehow eradicated. There is no longer slave nor free, so that socioeconomic difference, Jew nor Greek, that ethnic difference, and male and female, Paul says. There's no longer male and female, so that gender difference is no longer, but all are one in Christ Jesus. And so the question becomes, what was the role that women played in the early church? And many scholars have suggested that the church was very open to women's leadership. We know from the writings of Paul, he gives greetings. Half of the greetings he offers are to women. There's also the story about Paul and Thecla. I don't know if you know about this, but this image that I'm showing you here about the cave grotto that I think this is in Ephesus of, yeah, Paul and Thecla at Ephesus. Thecla and Paul were seen as partners, missionary partners, suggesting that, that Thecla could prophesy, Thecla could preach, all of these things. But then, there's some real ambivalence in Paul as well, because we know that even though he says in Galatians 3:28 that there is no longer slave nor free, male and female, Jew or Greek, we know that elsewhere, certainly in the Pauline pastoral epistles, First Timothy, for example, that women need to be modest and silent in the church. But also in First Corinthians, now this is one of the authentic letters of Paul, and I think I can't remember exactly where it is. And so some of you biblical scholars, please remind me. But Paul also says that women need to be silent in the congregation. This was in First Corinthians, right? And it is in the context of him talking about everybody having different gifts, and no one is better than the other. So how do we explain that? And that's where I wanted to come back to, because we talked a little bit about this last time. Um, any thoughts on that? Why would Paul say in one of his authoritative letters that there's no difference between men and women, but and then in one of his actual authentic letters, I should say, not authoritative, but authentic letters, uh, he suggests that women should be silent in the congregation. Any
Yeah,
thoughts?
yeah, Dan,
Yeah,
I do. I
yeah,
noticed that in her writing, when she gets to that point, Fredrickson says, I think just in parenthesis, interpolation, question mark. And
yeah,
then I go back to, I think it was Crosan who had an argument in his book as to why that was an interpolation. And I
correct.
seem to recall you saying that you were not particularly convinced by his line of argument, but apparently it's out there and it's recognized, at
Yeah.
least by Paula Fredrickson.
You mean that it was an interpolation? In other words, it was something that
Yes.
was placed back into the letter. Yeah,
The editor
I
threw
really,
that in there because,
yeah, yeah, and that's what I wanted to get to at this point. I don't remember being not convinced by that argument. I am convinced by it.
okay, good. I'm glad
I am
just remembered.
convinced that it's an interpolation, but there may be some nuance to Crossan's presentation that I not that I would ever, in any authoritative way, uh, take issue with Crossan. But I think in all of this, what 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 Fredrickson is trying to do is to demonstrate that, the church has gone to great well, some churches, some denominations have gone to great lengths to try to incorporate and to, welcome women into leadership roles in the last 50 years, especially. But to try to establish that in some authoritative way in first century practices is really, really difficult. There do seem to be suggestions that women have these leadership roles, but we also see in the context in which the church is developing, and especially as it develops past the first couple of generations, we see that there's just a lot that's mitigating against that happening. And certainly we know that by the time of um, the third century or so, uh, women are pretty much relegated to secondary roles. We see this, in Roman culture, uh, Roman practices, as well as in some of the Nag Hammadi documents. There's some ambivalence in those as well. Or the Gospel of Thomas, for example, one that we probably know better than the Gospel of Mary, says that Jesus is going to make one of his disciples a male so that he can receive the knowledge of God. So I wanted to just give you, I can't remember if I read this for you last time, but if I did. So, I mean, this is especially relevant to us right now because given the fact that we've got a new Pope, Leo 14th, name so chosen because of his predecessor, Leo the 13th, was one that was focused during the time of the Industrial Revolution on the rights and rights of immigrants and the rights of human beings in the workplace and things like that. Um, Pope Leo the 14th does not seem to be any more open to women in leadership roles in the Roman Catholic Church as was his predecessor, though that still remains to be seen. But Fredrickson concludes her section in this way. Could women hold church offices? Male prelates dominate our literary sources. Inscriptions, though, and not many of these, hint in other directions, where women are designated presbytera or episcopa. Later church canons will rule that women should not hold ordained offices. Perhaps this means that some did. Our slender evidence cautions against generalization, and the tendencies of the broader cultural context are clear. Roman antiquity was not marked by gender egalitarianism in any register, whether within Christian communities or outside of them. So there's that issue to consider. Any thoughts on that before we move on to a little later heresy?
Dan.
Yeah.
One of the contrasts that we see when Jesus arrives, literally in Jerusalem, is that he comes in a humble context, but as a servant.
Yeah.
And on the other gate, we see the guy who's giving the orders. And maybe there's something in there about the role of a person in society.
Mhm.
And that some of those roles are quieter. I'm just hypothesizing here, but the importance seems to stay there, but then it gets twisted when Jesus arrives and Paul starts observing the value of everyone in a different context than they were considered before.
Yeah, right. Um, and my thinking is that Paul, in his apocalypticism, probably believed, most likely believed, the man himself, the historical being, that the kingdom was at hand and living kingdom values was what needed to happen. He was fully convinced that Jesus was returning soon. Of course, he dies before that happens, as we will probably. And the church has to carry on. And more, the church starts to just take on the trappings of its Roman context. Uh, and that kind of hierarchical relationship. Certainly, we see this by the time of Constantine, right? But for one bright and shining moment, this is my thinking on this. One bright and shining moment, I think Paul was all about just a radical reversal of all human values that dealt with separation and hierarchical organization of people, all being one in Christ Jesus. So yes, Paul's telling women to be silent in church is most likely an interpolation. Um, any other thoughts? Well, the movement into the centuries of trying to maintain a sense of how diversity can be managed and identified in such a way that it can be, maintained, while at the same time being true to whatever sense of orthodoxy we have. Remember, we're not quite to orthodoxy yet. We will begin to see true orthodoxy after Constantine. But it is starting to become a little bit more political. Uh, and we see this especially in the late third and fourth century uh, authors or theologians. First of all, one by the name of Mani, who was, actually a student of Marcion, and with all of the suspicion of, the darkness of the world and everything. And you probably know a little bit about Manichaeism because we've talked many times about Zoroastrianism, the idea of, this cosmological understanding of the world as being this, eternal battle between light and darkness. And there are, at least in Zoroastrianism, there are uh, two gods, Ahura Mazda, who is the good god of light, and Angra Mainyu, the god of darkness. And every human being is a microcosm of that battle. I know I've said it many times. It's the classic idea of the angel and the devil on the shoulder. Human beings have free will, uh, but uh, but they're too often mired in ignorance. So the way uh, to achieve salvation in Zoroastrianism is to rise above that. Well, essentially the same thing is going to happen in Manichaeism, but by the third century. Uh, Mani and others have somehow come into contact with Buddhism as well, which isn't surprising given the communication that's happening across Asia at that time. But Mani comes up with a cosmology that's strikingly similar to that of Zoroastrianism. The idea being that there is a divine spark that is trapped in darkness. And that divine spark is what we might call our soul. And it is the fate of human beings never to be able to achieve their true humanity until that divine spark can be released from the prison of its body. And so Mani, this is where Buddhism comes in, focused on a kind of ascetic uh, practice and discipline that would allow that spark to be released. Now, it's very interesting to me that this may have had some connection with the Essenes as well, because a lot of what we're talking about sounds very much like the Essenes, especially when we consider the fact that Manichaeans at this time had a kind of two-tiered organization of their church. There were those who were called to be the ascetics, right? And this is very similar to what we know as Theravada Buddhism. There are certain people who are going to, achieve this release from the world. And then there you would have, let's call them the monks, right? And then you would have those who supported the monks in a community around them. They would bring them food. They would give them all the moral and especially material support that they needed. This is how the Essenes were organized, very much the way the Essenes were organized. The monks lived off in the desert, for example, at Qumran. And then there were people who were devoted to, the Essene way of life, who continued to carry out, their workaday lives, but supported the monks in Qumran. By the third century, we see something very similar to this. Um, Apart from the fact, that the Manichaeans rejected everything about the Jewish scriptures. They, like Marcion, they saw them to have been mired in ignorance. But why this is especially interesting, remember this kind of qualitative dualism between light and dark, and between spirit and matter, between looking at the world in a very binary way. This is going to influence a young devotee of Manichaeism by the name of Augustine. Augustine spent, uh, after living a life of debauchery and licentiousness in his college days, uh, he became a devotee of Manichaeism, uh, and certainly saw the world in these terms. Of course, we know later on that Augustine, reading Romans, is devoted, or is converted to this new way of thinking about God, and he becomes, a monk. He becomes devoted to Christianity. But many would say that his Manichaean um, sentiments were retained into his Christian life later on. But Manichaeism, interestingly enough, is something that is genuinely new, says Fredrickson. So we're starting to see by the third century that, there are Christianities that are starting to really diverge from the path. And Manichaeism is one of those. It's starting to incorporate Zoroastrianism. It's starting to incorporate, Buddhist ascetic practices, and it's not very difficult to see that, we've lost a kind of a majority share of Christianity in the entire system itself. So it's pretty easy to tell that this is, something that might be seen as heretical. Um, the next one, though, is a little bit more difficult. Let me stop and see what you have to say about Manichaeism. Well, by the end of uh, in the transition, let's just talk about what's happening. I think you are all pretty aware that by 312, Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity, and by 325, 13 years later, Christianity becomes the pretty much the organizing principle of the Roman Empire, the political organizing principle of the Roman Empire. And this is where Fredrickson is taking us toward the end of this chapter, is that by, prior to this time, we had an internal conversation that was going on in the church, right? On whether, for example, Jesus was fully God, or whether he was just a human being who is God inspired, things along those lines, these theological conversations. After Constantine and after the councils, it's not just a matter of heresy, but it's also a matter of being politically orthodox. The church and the state come to be one. So heresy just isn't an affront to theological thinking, isn't just affront to the church. It becomes an affront to the empire itself. And therefore, it's going to be far more dangerous to be a heretic at this time. And and as a result, some of the internal arguments, which are very, very, uh, let's say, subtle, the differences, which are very, very subtle, have outsized consequences. And this is certainly the case with a man by the name of Pelagius. And if you went to a Reformed seminary the way that I did, and if you're part of the Reformed tradition that is tends to be very, very conservative, there are certain people that you come to recognize as villains, and Pelagius was one of the first ones, right? For at that time, when you're in college or seminary, you just kind of take it at face value. Oh yeah, bad guy, Pelagius, right? But not really. I mean, these are subtle arguments about what it means to be Christian and what it means to be human and how it is that we understand the path by which we move forward ethically and living in community and things along those lines. But you probably remember that Pelagius is one who came sideways of Augustine by talking about free will. And if you can see this little chart that I have on the screen, I don't know if you're able to see it or not, but you can manipulate your images of everybody so that it shows up. That's what I have to do. Pelagius and Augustine come to talk about really what it means to be human, what happened in the garden. And remember, Augustine's coming from this Manichaean background uh, in which the material world is suspect, and there's this very binary type of way to think about things. But what Pelagius wanted to focus on was whether or not we as human beings could do anything good apart from the grace of God. And you probably know that Augustine is one who came up with this idea that, in the garden, because of the sin of Adam and Eve, original sin was carried on through the bloodline, or the spiritual bloodline at least, that the insubordination, the disobedience of Adam in the garden and Eve came to be an essential aspect of their children, Cain and Abel. Their sin became their children's sin, and their children's sin became, sin all the way down the line, which we come to know as original sin. Now, this is straight up Reformed theology, right? We see this certainly we see it in Paul, not so much original sin, but Paul talks about his inability to do anything apart from the grace of God. We're going to see it developed in Augustine. We're certainly going to see it in John Calvin and people coming afterwards. This is a straight line that goes all the way back to Paul and Augustine, you might say. Pelagius was like, yeah, not so much. I don't see it that way. I don't think human beings are born completely incapable of doing good. In fact, there's a great quote in here that summarizes it pretty well. Read on page 55. Let me see. I'm going to start right down at the bottom of 54. Okay, Pelagius himself was reformer, moving among the same Roman aristocrats as would Jerome. His teachings emphasized the importance of human effort to live a truly Christian life, by which he meant a dedication to asceticism, both moral and accordingly financial, meaning a commitment to support of the poor. That's Pelagius. In bringing the importance of individual effort to the fore of his message, Pelagius likewise foregrounded the importance of the freedom of the will, aided by divine grace. And here's his reasoning in a very simple sentence. Sin was not a condition, as Augustine said, but a choice. Otherwise, God would not be just in punishing the sinner. Sin to be justly punishable, in other words, had to be committed freely. If we are completely predisposed always to be sinful, then what kind of justice is there in blaming us or punishing us for something that is simply part of our nature? That's Pelagius's point of view. Augustine, being the philosopher he was, wanted to assure the sovereignty of God in that God did not owe anything to any human being based upon the actions of their free will. That way, God would be beholden to human beings, which would not make him much of a God, right? It would make him more of a slave. Oh, you did that, so I guess I have to do this for you now. You know, it's this transactional type of thing. So the battle lines are drawn. Pelagius and Augustine, you know, see human beings and human capabilities quite differently. Pelagius denied original sin. Augustine affirmed it. Pelagius believed that there was a natural will and ability to do what is good, that ignorance is what keeps us from doing what is good. And to tell you the truth, when I'm reading this stuff, I can't help but think of what's currently going on in our world today, right? Augustine, very much like Paul, says, no, there's nothing that we can do of our own free will. It's God's grace that is absolutely necessary. And Pelagius says, well, God's gracious indeed, but it's not necessary that we have God's grace in order to do what is right, what is good. That's an aspect of God's faithfulness in us. I mean, that God created us to be in God's image. God has free will. And though Adam, committed a sin in the garden, it wasn't an insurmountable and, unforgivable sin. We just need to realize that we don't follow Adam's, we don't want to follow Adam's example in this. And of course, all of this gets caught up in the issue that I don't really want to get into, but the issue of predestination. And, Augustine said that God foreknew from the beginning, in God's love, who his elect were going to be. And Pelagius, wanting to maintain, the idea of sovereignty of God, still wants to incorporate free will into it by saying, God did not foreordain the, the saved, but God foreknew. He had knowledge based upon his, omniscience of who would choose rightly and who would choose wrongly. So this it comes to be at the core of, well, frankly, some of the Wesleyan, the controversy that held between the Anglican Church and John Wesley, or between, the Reformed Church and Wesley. Do we as human beings have the ability to do good? Presbyterians, you probably know, say no, we don't. It's all about God. It's all about God's sovereignty. It's all about God's love. And then we just kind of sidestep the whole issue of, well, why is that just, So let me stop and see what kind of questions you have about that. Does this sound strikingly familiar?
Well, Dan, it sounds familiar in the sense that these are some of the exact same issues that we deal with today.
Exactly.
When we talk about the more orthodox interpretations of scripture, or the more enlightened ones that we have tended to focus on,
Right.
and a lot of that would, is considered heresy.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
They called they called Spong a heretic and ran him out of his job
Right.
because he was a heretic.
Right. Right.
And I think the Catholics did the same thing to Crozan.
Yeah.
So, things don't change all that much in 1,700 years
I
in
know.
terms of the issues that you try to wrestle with.
But I think it's interesting that the question, you can run a direct line of, I don't know, connection between Pelagius and the Enlightenment. I mean, the Pelagius is really very pre-Enlightenment, isn't he? You know, and he has a faith in God that's based upon a benevolent God who is a parent who is, you know, willing to allow for his or her sons and daughters to be free and make decisions and to pay the consequences for bad decisions. But this idea of this, sinners in the hands of an angry God, as Jonathan Edwards said, I mean, this is straight Augustine. These are two paths. And yeah, and I would say that, I mean, look who's in this study group, right? All of us are, fairly well educated. We recognize the importance of reason. In fact, we built our lives upon it, right? It just and through our activity as, as scholars or academics, we've come to establish a sense of well-being based upon, this common way that we live our lives. But we want to see that as being lived in the presence of God with the, with the, it's right what I'm looking for, with God's blessing, you know. But even in we're at First Presbyterian Church, I know that there are those who see this as the heretics group. You know? Will, you want to say something there?
Oh, thank you, thank you. I
Yeah.
think I'll toss this in. I've been thinking about it, but in 1960, and I may have mentioned this, in 1962 at the University of Kansas, I took a graduate class taught by a Czechoslovakian who came down from Canada, I think Denny's University, and he had a class called Church and State in the Middle Ages, and his first big piece was on the Zoroastrians and light and dark, and he explained that. But then
Mhm.
he moved a little bit past where we are to the Albigensians,
Yeah,
the
right.
Valdensians, and
Yeah,
how they were considered heretics
right.
and persecuted fiercely by the Roman Church. And
Mhm.
they lived in valleys in the Western Alps where France and southwestern Switzerland and Italy come together.
Mhm.
And then, of course, it continued with, I guess you could say, Martin Luther and
Yeah,
Knox and all that. But so
right.
this theme of splits and schisms and persecutions, eh, that's the story.
Yeah. And then let me
Go
look.
ahead and correct me and
No, no,
explain it better if you want to.
no. I don't want to do that, but I do want to ask the question, why do we stay in the church? I mean, because when it really comes down to my commitments, I'm I'm a very committed humanist, right? And it's almost like you can't be a humanist and Christian at the same time these days. I'm absolutely incensed with what I see to be the threat to democracy, which I believe to be the pinnacle of human political organizational development, organization, right? The idea that began with the Magna Carta, or actually uh, in Europe, it begins with the Magna Carta. I would say really but begins with Moses in the Sinai Peninsula with the Ten Commandments and the Torah. But I look how easily the church, or some churches, many churches, have been able to be won over by a very autocratic type of leadership. And I just don't get it. But they're also the same churches that will focus in a very Augustinian way on, you can't trust reason. I mean, those scientists don't know what they're talking about, right? And this idea that expertise is somehow suspect. I mean, look at Robert F. Kennedy. What I don't know. Don't even get me started, but this keeps me up at night. And I think it probably does you as well. I'm I've never been more I guess frustrated with just how closely allied or how closely we have come to replicate Germany of the 1930s. I mean, it's just some one-to-one correspondences that are hard to, overlook. Any other thoughts before I just go off on a diatribe here? I don't want to I don't want to do that. So
Dan, the quest
Yeah.
for certainty, it seems to me, is, part of this uh, orthodoxy
yeah,
and
yeah,
and social control.
right. Yeah. And social control will inevitably step on the feet of those who, but it's like God with human beings, as Pelagius says, you have to trust that human beings, if given the choice, will do the good. That's a hard one for me. In many ways, I'm a Calvinist, you know, but as a humanist, I have to affirm that human beings, if given the opportunity to do good and having the right information, they will pursue the good, even though much of our evidence seems to be contrary to that. I mean, this is the confusion of our lives as theologians and as scholars. But we see what eventually happened. And it's probably no coincidence that Constantine and those in charge in around 312 and afterwards saw the importance of emphasizing that human beings need a certain kind of grace and thus a certain kind of control, lest they fall into disarray, right? So there needs to be, because they can't do it on their own. They don't have the ability to be, reasonable creatures. And that just serves the kind of, hierarchically arranged government that we're constantly moving back and forth between. So go ahead, Will.
Well, I just wanted to thank you for mentioning the Magna Carta.
Yeah.
And we all have that image of young King John riding out
Hmm.
to negotiate that and sign the Magna Carta. And it's really important
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
be on our minds today.
Sure. And the steps that were taken in the next, 500 years to arrive at John Locke and his understanding of, what it means to be human and what it means to be free and all of these things. Um, Two ways of looking at the world, and yeah, and I will go to my death, I'm sure, not not resolving this, you know, sooner or later, it's not going to be resolved because it's kind of been the leitmotif of Western history, at least. Um, but that was Augustine's context, and Fredrickson brings this up. Augustine was thinking back on some controversies. This is really kind of important to remember too. Uh, of course, Augustine lived in the latter half of the fourth century, but there was a intra-church controversy in uh, the later, uh, well, it was in the early part of the fourth century, around 303, 304 or so, under the persecution, I think it was Diocletian at that time, in which the emperor came to the church and said, "You must hand over your scriptures to us," right? And there were some who said, "Oh, sure, we'll do that. But you're the emperor, right? Here's the question of church and state." And there would be others who would say, "No, I don't think so. I don't think you can do that. You're not gonna take our scriptures from us." Um, the latter uh, were later called Donatists under, oh, I can't remember the name of the man. It's in Fredrickson's book. Uh, but the Donatists came to be really caricatured as those who um, believed that they had, kind of an exclusive right after, Constantine became emperor, that they weren't going to recognize the power of Constantine. They were going to kind of create their own little exclusive community within the church. And it would be Constantine who would rule against, okay, who was right in this controversy? Those who handed over their scriptures to the emperor, or those who did not, Those who did not were the Donatists. Well, what do you suppose Constantine said? Yeah, you guys did good things. You were subordinate to the emperor. Those of you who handed over your scriptures, you are the universal church. Those who did not, who think of themselves as exclusive, the Donatists, they are banished. They're excommunicated. So here you have the first example of the emperor now being the adjudicator of what is heresy and what is not. And so it's in this context, a generation or two later, that Augustine is coming up against Pelagius, right? And we're getting into the details of not theology as much as we're talking about legal matters here. Now we're talking about the operation of the state as much as we're talking about theology. So it worked to the advantage of the state to follow the Augustinian paradigm. I mean, who do you think would rule more easily? And how could you justify your rule more easily among people who were either, filled with original sin and couldn't do anything right, or those who were free and could use their free will? Well, it's a no-brainer. Just we don't want a bunch of people who are free out there. We want to keep them under our thumb. And thus begins, the slide into the autocracy that we're currently seeing. So anyway, any thoughts about that? I did want to point out that Pelagius, there is a movement today in contemporary Christianity on something called Celtic spirituality, and the spirituality of Ireland. And Pelagius is seen as one of the as one of the founders of that idea that the Spirit of God working with your free will can do good things in the world. So Constantine really becomes the game changer. It's after he becomes the emperor and after Christianity becomes the theological and legal infrastructure of the state that we start to see just a flourishing of heresiological writings, because now the onus is on the church to identify not just enemies of the church, but enemies of the state. And this is helpful. There's a man by the name of Eusebius who was a historian, Constantine's historian. And even though Constantine was pushing, and Fredrickson points this out, pushing for a highly unified Catholic, as in universal church, Eusebius's church history still gives us evidence that there was still great diversity among not just pagans, but Christians as well in the early fourth and even into the 5th century. I like what Paula Fredrickson says, that orthodoxy has a very limited shelf life. In the 1st century, the example she gives, in the 1st century, it was orthodox to be a millenarian, to think of the coming of Christ. That was orthodoxy, right? Well, 2 or 3 centuries after that, that becomes almost a heresy, right? Because you don't want the return of Christ when you spent so much time setting up the kingdom of God on earth, the city of God, may I name it that, as Augustine did, right? And so now that we have this game change with Augustine, heresy becomes this legal category. and orthodoxy becomes the tool of the state. And I'll conclude with this quote from Fredrickson. Imperially sponsored creeds, now generated by imperially sponsored councils, ultimately set the limits of a Christian theological diversity. And these are the creeds that we know happened after the Council of Nicaea, the Constantinopolitan Creed, the Athanasian Creed. They're setting the limits of diversity. Diversity can happen, but only within these bounds, the creedal statements of the church. In principle, the product of consensus, creeds function to signal episcopal allegiance to the emperor's will. After Constantine, concord could be coerced, right? This becomes, many believe, the downfall of so-called true or native Christianity in the beginning of a very imperial type of Christianity. So that was on page 58. Are there any questions or comments? Go ahead, Will.
Well, what you just said was a good preface to what I said earlier about
Yep.
the persecution of the Albigensians and the
Yeah,
Valdensians. Yeah.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You're bringing in Waldensians now too. I mean, they're all over the place.
Well, and the persecution was brutal from my reading.
Yeah,
Of course,
yeah,
it's been 60 years, but I remember it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It was very brutal, and it was a uh a witch hunt, basically.
Mhm.
Um, I wanted to, any other comments on the bits before we move into a new chapter? Okay, here it goes. Well, I'll just leave you with this and we'll pick up with it when we come back next Wednesday. And we're going to be moving into the idea of persecution and martyrdom. And I just love the very first section of Fredrickson's chapter on Paul. I think it's called Pre-Christian Christian Persecution. It was very eye-opening to me, and it's great that you can always learn something new. But the whole idea of why Paul, reputed to be a persecutor of Christians early on in his life, though the evidence of that is kind of scanty at best, given internal readings of the Bible. But we certainly know that he was persecuted, if I can use that terms, or he was locked up in prison, he was stoned, he was whipped, all of these things. And why? Was it the Romans acting on behalf of the Jews who didn't like him coming into their synagogue? No, it was something else. And we'll talk about that next time. But anyway, this is the preface, or the epilogue, or is that the right word? The prologue to her chapter. Ancient people did not distinguish between religion and politics. The more things changed, the more they stayed the same. The well-being of cities and of the empire was thought to rely on good relations between heaven and earth. Good relations meant proper observance of pious rituals. By opting out of traditional Mediterranean observances, Gentile Christians sometimes drew down upon themselves the negative attention of their pagan neighbors, of Roman magistrates, and eventually Roman emperors. Some were persecuted to the point of death. The memory of these persecutions was greatly magnified in the period after Constantine, when the ideology of martyrdom became an essential component of Christian identity. So that is going to, in a nutshell, is going to be what we're looking at in the coming chapter. So anybody want to have the last word before we move on? We're a small, intrepid group today. I don't know if this book is sending people scattering hither and yon, but
Dan, you wanted one word, and this is a complete diversion, but I'm listening to what you asked me a week ago, and the one word is Banksy.
oh, yeah, okay.
Someone is
That's it.
trying to figure out his philosophy, which I find kind of fun, and it brings us way into our current century.
Yeah.
But he has a new piece of art, and they found it in Spain. I think it's in Marseille, and he talks the writer in the BBC. That's what I sent you. Was talking about the connection between Banksy and Plato. So if y'all find
Right.
the latest drawing from Banksy and Marseille, you will understand my connection. Now I'll
That's
throw
right.
that as
Thank
a
you for
crumb.
sending that. I could not remember that article. I had read it like 2 days before we got together, and by that time, my thoughts had been pushed out of my brain, you
Same
know?
here. I
Yeah.
just thought it was fun that that people were trying to figure out what Banksy, of all people, someone who smears graffiti all over, but interestingly,
Or that he,
what he's
or
thinking
that,
about and how
yeah, or that he had
philosophical
a
it can be.
systematic way of doing his art, right?
Mhm.
I never really thought that it would have come back to Plato,
It does.
but well, as I think it was Whitehead who said that, all of philosophy is just footnotes on Plato. So um, we'll leave it at that. All right, everybody. Thank you for your participation, commitment to our reading. So see you next week.